It is Sunday, November 25th, 2018. This is Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur. This is the instant reaction show where we come in after the game of the Seahawks game. Usually, most of the time, I want to say every week, but that would be a lie. So I want to make sure to be forthright and honest with you and say we're coming to you after this Seahawks game this week, though. And that would be a 30-27 win over the Carolina Panthers, a huge win for Seattle as the win gets them up to 6-5, drops the Panthers at 6-5, and gives Seattle a head-to-head tiebreaker advantage against the Carolina Panthers. It is a huge win on the road at 10 a.m. and all that other hoopla surrounding a game that you can, sort of look for and know that the Seahawks were up against some certain disadvantages, and certainly some of those disadvantages came to them in the form of, Carolina doing almost anything they wanted to do on offense up until and to the point of being in the red zone, which is a big reason for Seattle's win today. And we'll get into all that today with myself, Kenneth Arthur of Field Goals, as well as John Morgan, my guest and co-host, I guess you could say, today on the Seaside Chats podcast. The Seaside Chats podcast is available at patreon.com. This episode here is for free. Most of the episodes and a lot of the episodes behind just a $2 a month paywall. That's a $2 a month paywall for the Instant Reaction Show and the podcast Seaside Chats, previewing games each week. But this one I want to put out there for free, and also with the help of a sponsor. We are sponsored today by the Injury Legal Center, a personal injury law firm who has been specializing in auto accidents in California, Nevada, and Washington for over 20 years. And if you have an auto accident or a slip and a fall, you can call Injury Legal Center toll free at 855-631-3830, and they'll immediately set you up with a doctor and handle all contact with the insurance companies for you. And I'll hit them up again at the end of the episode. Just want to give a shout out and a thank you to our sponsor, Injury Legal Center, so that we can bring this out to you for free to listen to talk about the Seahawks 30-27 win over the Carolina Panthers. Russell Wilson goes 23 of 31, 339 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. A lot of his impact coming in the second half, the third and fourth quarter. Had another one touchdown that fell just a yard shy by Trey Madden. Had another touchdown possibility in an overthrow to Doug Baldwin. Some miscommunications there perhaps, but a good game by Russell Wilson. The Seahawks are managed to do just enough on offense and just enough on defense, including force an interception of Cam Newton. The turnover battle, again, important as the Seahawks win the turnover battle 1-0. And it could have been a lot worse given the 5 or 6 fumbles by Carolina that were recovered by Carolina. And John, there's a lot of storylines to go over today, whether that be Wilson, whether that be Christian McCaffrey, whether that be Graham Gano and Sebastian Janikowski, so on and so forth. Including and down to the playoff races. John, you've watched many Seahawks games, and today this is, no different, a very important game for them if they want to get to the playoffs. What's your big takeaway today for the Seahawks in terms of what they were or were not able to do against the Panthers?
Well, the biggest takeaway, I think, is just that Seattle's passing offense did so well at the end of the game in a really high leverage situation when they really couldn't rely on the run. So that was very good to see. There was a moment late in the game when the blitz pickup was just so beautiful and allowed Wilson to really sit back there and survey the field. And it was just as heartening as can be, because that's exactly what's been missing so far this season. And it's, I think, what Shoddy and Carroll really want to see from Wilson is him developing into a mature passer who can win the game entirely with his arm. So that has to be the big takeaway, because that was excellent. Wilson put the team on his back. Lockett was excellent. And having a passing offense is the key to consistent contention in the NFL.
Yeah, John, this is your first time on the podcast, and, we haven't gotten into it a ton. We haven't gotten into it at all between me and you in terms of passing versus running. It is probably the most volatile and, what's the word I'm looking for? Just the biggest topic of conversation, and, both sides arguing.
I guess.
What's that?
Very controversial.
Yeah, it is controversial, and it brings out some of the worst in people and some of the best in terms of, trying to dig into what the reality is. Today, the Seahawks run it 28 times for 75 yards and a touchdown, 2.7 yards per carry. The Panthers run it 27 times for 220 yards, 8.1 yards per carry, and the Seahawks win 30-27. So it's almost the opposite of what you may have expected. Not that the Panthers are a bad running team by any means, but the Seahawks, who had just been dominating on the ground for the last, basically 2 months, get torched on the ground and end up winning and holding Carolina to 27 points. A lot of that being, like I said, in the red zone. Did you see anything to, in terms of the running game with Chris Carson, anything to make you change your mind or think like, oh, the Seahawks offense wasn't as good as it could have been if not, if it wasn't for the fact that Chris Carson only had 3.4 yards per carry, and as a team, they just didn't get much done on the ground?
Well, Carson's got to stop Shady McCoying the ball. I mean, he has a terrible habit of taking the ball away from his body and just leaving it out there exposed. And there were multiple times where if the fumble bounced another way, or if the ball came out just a split second earlier and was called a fumble, that it could have changed the entire game. So it's obvious way Carson is the back that they lean on. He's able to get really consistent yardage. He's able to run into what looks like a situation where there's no hole and just be able to fit and go downhill. And the Seahawks predicate their offense on that consistent positive yardage. So yards per carry can be somewhat misleading. What they really want to do is be consistently improving their position towards getting a new first down. And Carson is typically very good at that. But Carolina really sold out to stop the run. And that's what their defense is better at. Their defense actually is very bad at stopping the pass this year. And as soon as Corn Elder made an appearance, I think the whatever good pass defense they had just completely vanished. And I think that defies expectations a lot, because going into Carolina, you expect this really excellent defense, but their defense has been very poor this year. I think it ranks 25th by Football Outsiders metrics. There isn't an obvious ranking system, the ESPN analytics, but it's well below average. And so, but that's not to take anything away from Wilson. He didn't exactly beat a tough defense, but he did so much. He was putting up Drew Brees type efficiency numbers that it doesn't really matter what kind of defense he was facing, and in high leverage situations. So they continued to run the ball. They have to do that. I think that's vital both to the overall ability for the wide receivers to get open and for the pass protection. But I also think there's at least something that, who knows if it's provable through statistics, but there's something to be said for just keeping the defense fresh and making sure that no one gets tired out and that Carolina couldn't just start to, impose their will, so to speak.
Yeah, and speaking of Carolina's offense and imposing their will, Cam Newton does go 25 of 30 for 256 yards and 2 touchdowns. He had the interception in the end zone by Bradley McDougald, tipping it to himself and coming down with a huge pick. The Seahawks' first interception or first turnover of any kind in almost a month. But Christian McCaffrey did have 17 carries for 125 yards and a touchdown, as well as 11 catches for 112 yards and a touchdown. But even those big gains, the Seahawks were just able to, make them make another play by stopping them short of the end zone. And we saw that pay off for them in the first drive on defense with forcing a 4 and out. In terms of defending Cam Newton and defending that type of offense, the Seahawks did hold them to just enough to win the game. And some of that having to do with Graham Gano missing a field goal at the end, having to do with not trying a field goal in the beginning of the game, and the turnover by Cam Newton. How did you think that the defense did against Cam Newton and Chris McCaffrey? Obviously, it would be hard to praise them or Ken Norton, but what are your thoughts as well, just on the totality of the first season of the Ken Norton defense?
If I was looking for indicators of overall quality, I would say Seattle's defense did really poorly. Obviously, Christian McCaffrey was running free into the second level over and over again, and their ability to cover him as a receiver was practically non-existent. I mean, he was targeted 11 times, and he caught every single one of those passes for over 10 yards per reception. And watching the line play, the interior defense for the Seahawks, you can tell that they're still kind of reeling from the loss of Malik McDowell, because now that Reed has slimmed down a bit and has become a much better pass rusher, he just doesn't have that same kind of ability to hold up against double teams. And they don't really have another defensive tackle who is really able to consistently do what is asked of them, especially in run defense. Like Naz Jones feels like he's a bit of like a Red Bryant kind of misfit. He looks a little bit like a 3-4 end. And while he's, just a terrific athlete, and I root for him so much because he has so much talent and so much willpower, he doesn't look great when you see him in the middle of the line. He often is getting pushed around or bullied. He gets cleared sideways or he gets pushed back. And so Seattle's probably going to have to address that in the offseason. I think that's going to be a consistent problem for them. The run defense has just been, especially with Calitro out there, I think that Calitro is a guy who has to cheat and guess a lot to compensate for his overall lack of quickness. And you can see it when teams attempt to attack Seattle on the edges. So I would say that when you look at it like for indicators of future success, you'd say, okay, the Seahawks defense really didn't look very good at all. They just got kind of torn apart. But if you look at it for like heart and critical moments and when the game was on the line, how did they perform? I would say they did exceptionally. And who knows if you can carry that into next week, but it kind of doesn't matter. They banked the win. There was some critical stops in the red zone. That interception was just excellent. McDougald is clearly a ball hawk. And so while I don't know how many members of the secondary are going to be a part of the next great Seahawks secondary, I think that they really found something in McDougald in the free agency.
Oh yeah, and you make a good statement with they banked the win. I mean, when the game was in the fourth quarter, that's all I could think about was it doesn't really matter a ton right now to in terms of how they win. If the Seahawks win, they have a very good shot at getting to the playoffs, and if they get to the playoffs, anything can happen. As well as we've seen the Seahawks just become a different beast in December. And, we've seen them make bigger shoots up the DVOA rankings in December from the middle of the pack to number one by the end of the year, just in how dominating they can be. And not saying that the Seahawks will become that dominating. We don't know what's going to happen next. The fact that they have 4 of their next 5 games at home is certainly encouraging. The 2 of those games are against the 49ers is even more encouraging. But in terms of banking the win, they get to 6-5, and that's what's important is that they put themselves in playoffs position. And when you look at the entire schedule, this is now a team that is 6-5. Their 5 losses coming at Denver. Denver's a top 10 DVOA team. At Chicago. Chicago is, I think, number 3 in DVOA. Of 2 games against the Rams, both very close. The Rams are, of course, number 1 and number 2 in DVOA, and then against the Chargers, who were number 5 or 4 again in DVOA. So all 5 of their losses have come to just strong teams by DVOA. The only one that you could really call questionable, of course, being the Denver Broncos with Case Keenum. But that being said, the New Orleans Saints lost to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in week 1. It's just a weird week where not a lot of people know what to go off of. And you're making a lot of guessing, it seems like, in the week 1. So just laying that all out there and including their win in Detroit. Detroit's not a great team, but it was a 2-touchdown win over a team that has beaten some good teams this year, beating the Green Bay Packers, beating the Carolina Panthers on the road. How strongly do you feel about the Seahawks right now, John? Are they, pretty solidly as good as their 6-5 record? Do you think that they could be a little bit better? The personnel obviously doesn't feel as strong as it did in their heyday. And I think we could easily pick apart how a team isn't going to be as good without Earl Thomas or without Richard Sherman. We saw some issues maybe with Shaquille Griffin, not just today, but this whole season. I mean, maybe Trey Flowers being the best cornerback back there for Seattle. But how do you feel about how strong Seattle is right now?
I think that they're in a good position. They're probably not a legitimate contender this year, but of course, we've seen some crazy things happen in the NFL. The NFL is such a incredibly high variance league where the any given Sunday mantra. And so, I mean, just being able to make it into the tournament would be sensational. And just the fun of that and the ability to use that as a motivational tool for Carroll, I think that draft position is just absolutely out the window at this point. And it's, win, win, win. Absolutely everything should be about winning, doing the best they can this season. That said, there's some good, young talent that they can work from. But there's also there are a lot of holes. And so eventually we're going to be thinking about the offseason, and it's going to be a very important offseason. It's going to be a situation where they're going to have to really assess the secondary, figure out who's going to stick there. The problem I see with Shaquille Griffin is he just doesn't seem to have the greatest ball skills. And that's a real problem in this sort of defense because you're going to be put in a situation where you're going to either be allowing a jump ball or you're going to be potentially intercepting the pass. And when Richard Sherman was his absolute greatest, quarterbacks were afraid to throw over there because he could shadow the route. He could find the ball in space, in the air and become a better receiver than the receiver. And I've never seen anything like that from Shaquille. And unfortunately, 2 seasons in, it's one of those skills that you kind of wonder if he's ever going to develop. And so a lot of members of the secondary, and likewise, while Flowers is sound and he's a good tackler, and that can't be underestimated in a bend but don't break defense, because I've seen bend but don't break defenses with bad tackling and they just completely fall apart. He's still someone I wonder if one day he's going to just be exposed, because he's kind of slow. He's kind of slow to react. He's often put into tough positions. His ability to stay on top of the receiver and just get those open field tackles have saved him. But you don't see members of the secondary outside of McDougald really doing much. And so you almost wonder, is this the scheme and the effectiveness of the scheme and the effectiveness of the coaching to put the players in the right place really coming through? Because this right now is about a kind of middle of the road defense. And with a pretty good pass rush and some really good talent, I see the secondary not doing a lot. I see McDougald getting some really big turnovers, but for the most part, I see him out there and they're more or less breaking even and occasionally just being burned. And so I think that Seattle's probably going to have to assess that. The good part is that it's cheap and it's young. It's a lot of guys under rookie contracts. There's still some potential for development. I'm always a little bit more pessimistic than I think the average fan. I know that in the NFL, so often rookies just break out right away. And college is such a good preparation for the pros that there is not typically a really long learning curve. And so when guys are only kind of doing okay, even into their second season, I start thinking, and I think coaches start thinking, this is a position where we're going to, at the very least, start to add some competitive depth. So I think that it's a team that, it really depends. I mean, the great thing about youth is that when veterans are often, amassing injuries and getting tired, youthful players start really flashing, because I think the difference in speed and the difference in agility and the difference in health really start showing up. And that's one of the reasons I think Pete Carroll's teams have often broken late. And so there's potential, but I just don't want to like commit to almost any of these guys, because I think I'm seeing the scheme work, and to an extent the pass rush work, and I'm not seeing those kind of plays where I would say that defensive back really did something to change the outcome of the game.
John, you talk about pessimism, which is a totally fair and I think reasonable, assessment. I think I probably fall more on the optimistic scale, I believe, and it's fine to balance each other out in that way, and I. We both belong to a small alumni, a fraternity of people who have been the managing editor at Field Goals. And, I'm curious, too, because you were there around the beginning of Pete Carroll's tenure at the Seahawks. And at that time, the Seahawks weren't playing very well. They were okay in terms of record, but even worse, by DVOA or whatever, their record at 7-9 in 2010. I think certainly you were critical of Pete Carroll at times, and I only ask you this not to put you up in a microscope of, hey, in hindsight, what's this now? But I am curious just how your opinion of Pete Carroll has or hasn't evolved over his 8 years. And do you think, because obviously there are peaks when you win the Super Bowl in 2013 and get close in 2014, and there are valleys like the last couple of years. And right now it's easy to feel like we're sitting on a cloud following, two very dramatic and exciting wins for Seattle. But as far as the direction of the Seahawks under Pete Carroll, how do you feel about them today?
I guess I'm critical of everything. I mean, that's probably my nature. And of course, when Pete Carroll came in, I think I was initially excited because it felt like one of those franchise shifting Paul Allen kind of hires, where he was really making sure that he found someone that there was kind of no question about the potential that Pete Carroll had, and having just suffered Mora, who was just one of the worst coaches I've ever seen, and who seemingly lost his team halfway through the season. I was certainly optimistic for what was the potential, but I think there was also I think pessimism was to some extent just a natural counter to Carroll's like incredible optimism. Now that said, I actually really admire his optimism, and I think it's a big part of why the team has done so well. And I think he's the best coach in Seahawks history, and I don't think that's necessarily a minor thing to say, because I think Holmgren was excellent, even if he had his own problems. And of course, Knox was excellent, but he too also had his own problems. And so I'm excited. I mean, once you have a good head coach and they can master one half of the ball the way he does on defense, and then you get the franchise quarterback, you're basically in the situation that everyone envies. And so while I don't know exactly when this team is going to really become a true contender again, they've got the basic foundation to be a true contender. And then it's just about kind of hitting your picks in the draft. Unfortunately, that's been a real problem for them. And if the last few years, the kind of malaise Seattle has felt, I think, is the fact that they've had this talent drain where they're really great players, their superstar players are kind of advancing out of their prime, and then you're not getting the kind of reinforcements you'd really like to see from the young guys. And I was really happy for this draft and thought there were going to be a bunch of really big contributors, but unfortunately, it's turning into another draft class that at least through 1 year, other than Dixon kicking the hell out of the ball, you're not seeing these guys too much. Penny is very boomer bust, and every so often he looks like he's special, but he's not doing what Seattle wants, which is really hitting the hole and moving forward and making sure there's positive yardage. And even like when he doubled back across the field, and that was so awesome, there was this part of me that was saying, that's not what you want to do in the NFL. That's not going to last for long. And half the time you do this, you're going to get dropped for a 5 or 10 yard loss or something like that, which is just drive killing. And so I guess I'm always sort of mixed. I think when you're a fan, and you are somewhat pessimistic, it can feel kind of almost unnatural because the very nature of being a fan. But it's just was when you're running a site, you're constantly looking for material, and criticism is something that inspires conversation. And I think it's a fair position to take because who is above criticism, um, but this, and I don't want to be one of those fan sites that was just nothing but rah rah, and especially with
Right.
the position I was given when I first started out, with it being kind of the end of the Holmgren years and the Ruskell talent drain, and then Mora and the embarrassment of that, him going after the kicker and stuff like that. I think that I had kind of gotten into I got used to being skeptical. And likewise, I think I was very skeptical of Russell Wilson too, because I think that my concern with Russell Wilson was that I had not seen a quarterback consistently succeed in the way that he was going to seemingly have to succeed. Now, I was completely wrong about that. I mean, he was just absolutely sensational, and he was one of the best quarterbacks in football for years. But I love being wrong that way. I mean, one of the nice things about being somewhat pessimistic as a fan or when covering a team is that my joy for when the team proves me wrong and does really well completely overshadows my pride of having to be right or wrong. I mean, I've been wrong so many times that I've stopped worrying about it.
Yeah, and I mean, I have to admit my own unbelievable benefit of basically joining Field Goals in the middle of the 2011 season, and basically that was, I believe, the Falcons game was the first game that I was there for, and then shortly after that, they got blown out by the Bengals, and then pretty much after that, they rarely lost again, and blowouts were even extremely rare. So it was easy in the Russell Wilson era for me to sit here and be like, the Seahawks are great. How could anyone criticize them? But even then, I know people, that only raises expectations, and you're always working in some sort of balance to say, well, it's one thing to say, if you're the Cleveland Browns right now, if you're a Browns fan, you're writing about the Browns, you are ecstatic that they not just beat the Bengals today in a blowout, but are nearing 500, and you're thinking you're ecstatic. But the Seahawks are 6-5, and even then, there's a lot of people who are critical of the team, don't like the direction of the team, want the Seahawks to make a move either with Pete Carroll or Russell Wilson. Expectations change all things, and certainly the Seahawks have higher expectations now. One of the things the Seahawks did to try and get out of the funk the last couple of years was focus on that run game, as well as make changes at their coordinator positions. I asked you about Ken Norton. You've mentioned Brian Schottenheimer. We've talked about, how did you feel about the play calling today? Whether it was in the first quarter or the fourth quarter, how do you feel about Brian Schottenheimer's play calling overall? Do you think that he has a significant amount of control? Do you think he's or do you think he's just sort of Pete Carroll's hands to take the blame when things go wrong?
I think that he has a significant amount of control. I think definitely Carroll oversees every part of the team, and that I don't think it's necessarily wrong for a head coach to get into his offensive coordinator's ear and to give him some sort of general guidelines. Right after a game, it's somewhat hard to assess play calling. I mean, you have that intuitive feeling when you're watching it, like, oh, that seemed like it surprised the defense, or that seemed like just the right decision. And I have felt that way with Shoddy. I think that he has a certain amount of feel for the game, which is very encouraging.
You
But
there?
at the same time, I wouldn't say the offense is necessarily inspiring with all of its, elegant play design or misdirection.
Oh.
It's definitely a Pete Carroll designed system where it's about execution, doing your job, which is not necessarily bad. But you don't necessarily think to yourself, "Oh, what a brilliant offensive coordinator! They're going to reinvent the game." That's not the kind of coordinator he is. So I guess I'm kind of ambivalent. I worry about any offensive coordinator who relies so much on the run because it's hard to make a case that the run is nearly as valuable as passing. But I think it's also clear that he intends to pass. And though he runs a lot, he's trying to compensate for the fact that Seattle has no real high volume game breaker receiver. Uh, you know, Baldwin has been a shadow of himself for most of the year. And while Tyler Lockett is excellent, and I think he's really starting to show just how much of a receiver he can be now that he's fully recovered from that injury. I mean, one of the things I really like about Lockett is there's a lot of quick guys and there's a lot of fast guys, but there's not a lot of guys who can really utilize that quickness and that speed in the moment to make guys miss. And you see Lockett doing that all the time. But that said, Lockett still seems like a low volume receiver who's never going to get consistently more than 5 or so targets a game. And so Seattle really needs someone else because this kind of offense needs that complementary number one receiver type player who can get the safeties back and then make it so the run game's even more effective. So, it's a transition year when you're transitioning from like the old guard to, like a new group of young guys. To do well is almost as like exciting as it gets. At the same time, there's just no way to know exactly who comes in next year, how they do in the draft, what kind of free agents they bring in. So I'm just kind of trying to live in the moment. I always entertain wild fantasies about them going on some sort of crazy run and winning the Super Bowl. I mean, that's just my nature. I think that I'm a pessimist in a self-protecting way because in my own life, I'm just like naturally super optimistic. And so I want to see this team do really well. I love to see the development of Russell Wilson. He didn't exactly beat up a really excellent defense or anything like this. They're averaging 25 points a game allowed. So I mean they didn't beat that by too much. But if you know the specifics, if you know the trouble Seattle has had traveling to the East Coast and playing early games, and you could see how much the Panthers were able to stop the run game, and especially the game situation, making Seattle highly one dimensional. It was just an exceptional game. It was so encouraging. It was everything I want to see out of Russell Wilson. You could see moments when the pass rush was coming, and he had that kind of happy feet panic that he sometimes gets, but then he settled and he said, "No, let me look. Let me see who's out there." And he did that again and again. And he just made some, he won the game as much as any player for Seattle. He won the game, and that's what you want. And I think the thing with me and Russell Wilson is that I love him as a player. He's probably the most valuable player in Seattle sports history. There may be some NBA player I'm not properly accounting for or something like that, but the value of a franchise quarterback to a football team is so great that I mean, once you're in that conversation, you're kind of being held to an even more impossible standard. And Wilson has clearly arrived as something special and probably without question the best quarterback in Seahawks history. But the new expectation is like, an order of magnitude higher. And so that's kind of what he has to be held to because that is what he is capable of. That's the expectation he set for himself. And so days like today where you could say, "Man, Russell Wilson really did it. He was clutch, he was in the moment, he was finding his guys, and he won the game." I mean, while that's awesome, and while you'd never say that should be the absolute expectation, it's not far from the expectation because that's what a franchise quarterback does. And so while I'm very high on him, I think that I come off as sounding uh like kind of pessimistic or highly critical, but it's really just because of the expectations he has created for himself and really the expectations that fans have to have if they want the Seahawks to re-enter a new window of contention because hoping for another Legion of Boom to just form is just not realistic. I mean, that was one of the greatest defenses in the history of the NFL. And so if Seattle's defense can get above average or top 10 with Wilson and his development and the beginnings of a good run game, and of course the line has looked better than it ever has in the Wilson era, there's really something here. But it's incomplete.
Yeah, and looking at it now, when you mentioned Russell Wilson as the level of quarterback that he's at, and if you look at the NFC playoff picture, really you've got the Saints and the Rams, and then after that, Russell Wilson and the Seahawks, if they get into the playoffs, easily have a case for being the number 3 team in the NFC, and especially like if you're just looking at it from a quarterback standpoint, because Aaron Rodgers is, not likely to make the playoffs. Matt Ryan is not likely to make the playoffs. Carson Wentz is not looking great for a chance to make the playoffs. If you're even looking for guys anywhere near that same level of playing field. And when you look at it and you say, if the Seahawks were to get the number 5 seed and you look at the rest of their schedule, certainly at home against the Chiefs will probably be, or at home on Monday night against the Minnesota Vikings, both chances that they have, if they get 10-6, get the 5 seed, whoever wins the NFC East is going to be the 4 seed. That could be Dallas. That could be Washington. Totally winnable games. And then in that second round, it's just going to be a matter of whether they face the Saints or the Rams, because going to LA, it's not a great matchup for the Seahawks in terms of, we know how outmatched they are offensively to defensively, but at the same time, they've known each other well enough to make all of those games close. And for the Rams to beat the Seahawks 3 times in a year would be quite the accomplishment. Really, the Saints seem to be the biggest one in between them at that point. I mean, the Saints and the Rams both, and the Bears. All these teams could be strong teams, but you'd be hoping for perhaps the Bears go to the Saints. I'm looking way ahead, but if you look ahead and the Bears beating the Saints, maybe the Bears are the team in the NFC Championship game, something like that. And certainly Russell Wilson, having a player of that caliber, you seem to have a chance, and that certainly has been the case this year, as the Seahawks have not lost a game by more than one possession this year. I don't know if there's another team in the NFL. I used to look at that every year because the Seahawks never lost any games by more than one possession, and I don't know how many teams can say that this year, but it is interesting how the Seahawks just simply do not get blown out. They keep every game within reach of some sort, and that is just so hard to do in the NFL. Tom Brady gets blown out. Aaron Rodgers gets blown out. These really good teams just get blown out every year, and the Seahawks stay in it. So looking at the end here, John, looking at the rest of the teams in the NFC, who do you like? And if looking at the rest of the Seahawks schedule, where they've got home 49ers, home Vikings, at 49ers, home Chiefs, home Cardinals, what's your outlook for the rest of the year? Any teams that you think you really find to be stronger or weaker in those wild card races?
I think that Seattle's outlook is excellent. I mean, this was the pivotal game. I think everyone knew that going to the East Coast and taking on the number 4 seed was going to be where we knew which way the season was going to break. And if they had lost today, their playoff chances would have gone way down, and it would have been a real uphill battle, even if they had won quite a few of the games going out. I don't know exactly which of their upcoming opponents that I feel worried about necessarily. Obviously, some of them are on the cupcake end of the spectrum. The Vikings feel a little bit like a sleeping giant. I think that Kirk Cousins could be a lot better than he is, and if they got that going, then you'd have a like a real contender. But I think that Seattle's probably got a good path to the playoffs, and I think that has to be their expectation at this point, with anything but that being a severe disappointment. And they're pretty close to in control of their own destiny. I mean, they're not currently in the playoffs, but if they continue winning, I don't think there's much chance that they will miss the playoffs. And I think it'll be good for the team, in that when Pete Carroll first took over, they had that 7-9 season and they were desperate for a quarterback. And if they had just lost that game, week 17 game, they would have missed the playoffs and they would have had that higher draft position. And you can get kind of too clever by half and start looking at things on the macro level and saying, man, it would be good if they, if they just lost here, because what chance do they have of doing anything special in the playoffs? And then they did something incredibly special in the playoffs, and it seemed to shift the attitude. It seemed to be a wonderful motivational tool for Carroll. And I think they're really right back into that position where what matters most is that Carroll can get to the young guys and say, now it is time to have that playoff type preparation for, to be a professional 24/7, to really own your position and to step up. And I think that's great for development. And development is so vital in NFL football because, when you look at success at the draft, it's close to a crapshoot. And so a lot of what seemingly makes the difference is teams that can take a player and figure out how to get through to them so that they, do what it takes, not just on the field, but off the field to be a pro and to be really strong. And Seattle's had, somewhat mixed results. Obviously, once the guys are, on the field, I think that they're excellently coached. But at the same time, Carroll's a little bit of a player's coach. I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, every person, every coach, every player is a balance between what they do well and what they do poorly. And you hope that they are more, that the calculus comes out that they have so much more positive attributes than negative attributes. And so I think that this is I don't know exactly who is their biggest rival to making it. It seems like their biggest rival is just crap in the bed, essentially. I mean, they're in the position where if as long as they're doing what they're capable of, they should make the playoffs. And it's not going to be taken from them by another team, I don't think. It's about showing up, beating the opponents they're supposed to beat, and winning the games that are close too. And if any of this could carry over, just the incredible sense of urgency and the high leverage situations where Seattle really showed up. If any of that could carry over, I could not believe this team not making the playoffs. They look so young, so ready, so healthy, and really hitting their stride and doing what they want to do. And to me, other than the complete collapse of the defense, which was pretty worrisome because some of those holes McCaffrey was running through, I think anyone could have run through. I mean, there was some just huge gashes where he was getting launched into the second level. And I'm sure that we'll hear about that from Carroll because that's so vital to how he schemes. But other than that, and if that can be fixed somehow, or if they can get Kalitro off the field, no offense to him, I think that he's doing his best. But I see him, when something bad is happening, I'm often seeing Kalitro nearby. I think that this team could even take another step. Now, as far as like doing well in the playoffs, some of that's just going to require something crazy happening. The Bears look like the exact kind of team that could potentially take out a high seed without maybe making it themselves. And so Seattle probably needs something like that. They need some sort of playoff chaos because I don't think that they're going to probably beat the Saints in the playoffs. The Rams, I think the Rams would be potentially exposed if Goff had to go into some sort of bad weather climate. He's notoriously bad at passing in bad weather climates. But since they're going to have home field and if they do have to travel, it's probably just going to be New Orleans. I think that they'll probably still do well. I mean, it doesn't seem like the NFL is figuring out what McVay is doing, so that they should at least make it through this season kicking butt. So I think it's really just on the Seahawks to maximize what they're capable of, and then they'll find a way into the playoffs. And then they just have to keep doing what they're capable of and hope for the best.
And how much would you?
I mean,
yeah, and how much would you alter? Just speaking of playing to their opponents and knowing what the Seahawks have ahead of them in terms of the NFC West in the next couple of years, how much do you alter your game plan and your offseason moves next year to counter the LA Rams, or do you just focus on being the best Seahawks that you can be?
I think Seattle has to do what they do. Carroll runs a scheme that is able to counter basically any defense or any offense. I mean, that's the idea, is that it's simple, but it cannot be exposed easily. As long as the pass rush is arriving, then the coverage is going to be sound because there's enough. The defenders are in the right place to do what it takes as long as the quarterback isn't out there having all day. So I don't think Seattle should necessarily adjust to what the Rams are doing. I mean, as incredibly strong as the Rams seem right now, this stuff often changes very quickly. I personally am not a big believer in Jared Goff. I don't see a huge shift in what he is doing individually. Obviously, he's finding open receivers and he's throwing good passes to them. But I don't think knowing his profile as a draft pick, that's too surprising. I mean, that's all well within his ability. And so I don't think that Seattle should try to build what they're doing around the Rams. I don't think that's even a good attitude overall because I believe that's kind of like almost like a subordinate or submissive attitude. Like they, like Seattle has to expect to be the number two and they have to beat the Rams. And who knows what'll happen with the Rams. But I think that Seattle's building really well. It's just that there's always kind of the dual forces of, progress from the young guys, but then also attrition from the old guys. And so it's hard to really forecast. Seattle really needs a lot of young talent on rookie contracts contributing. And they're still kind of break even with that, with, you know, a lot of what's really being done well by the veteran old guard. And so I don't know. I mean, I was happy that Carroll and Schneider had the foresight to really hoard draft picks, because it's been proven that's about the only thing you can do to consistently win in the NFL draft.
Yeah.
But the talent drain has just been massive. And with some of the young guys, at least, you know, by my own evaluation, not really doing terribly well, I think that there's kind of a position where this team could really break out and open their window of contention, like maybe even this season. If some of these young guys really start breaking through and doing well, I mean, think what it would mean if Penny was out there really doing something. You know, I mean, Penny has been a non-entity practically, and he's the only running back with game-breaking speed on the team. You know, Carson is consistent, but he's, you know, Mr. 3 to 15 yards, you know, and you're not going to really you're not going to intimidate the defense until you get someone out there who's going to potentially take it to the house every single time. And so I'm both, like often I'm optimistic with my hopes and I'm pessimistic with my assessment, because I see a lot of holes and I see a team that is doing really well. But even like today, when a game feels really fun and really exciting and you feel like you kind of admire the performance of some of the individual players, it is often, in fact, indicative of the game probably could have gone either way. I mean, this whole game was constantly in the balance, and there were a few plays that decided it. And it's so easy to see how those plays could have not happened or could have gone in Carolina's favor. So I think that, you know, Seattle's got a good foundation. Obviously, having Russell Wilson is the most valuable thing you can possibly have. And Pete Carroll seems to still have a very good head for defense. But it's not a team where you just have a whole bunch of young guys who are kicking butt you can project. There's a lot of guys who are probably at their level, and they need a new infusion of talent. And that could happen in 1 year. And that's one of the wonderful things about the NFL. But I really was hoping to see more out of this draft class. And I'm really surprised with some of the guys that I had hoped for to do better, that they have contributed so little so far.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot left out there on the table. Rasheem Green and certainly, yeah, more guys to see if they do step up. And certainly some of these position battles that will be decided next year will be interesting to watch, whether that's if Trey Flowers steps up to be the real number one cornerback next year, if Shaquille Griffin can, you know, improve his play, if Tedrick Thompson or Delano Hill can prove to be a regular starter. So lots of things to watch there, but certainly they need to add more pass rushers. There's no question that they don't have the number of pass rushers that they need on the team at this moment. They're going to need to get more guys in there and infuse that through the draft, through free agency, through trades. Wouldn't be at all surprising to me to see them trade their first round pick next year for a player again, as they did twice in the past. So we'll see what happens there. John Morgan, thanks so much for joining us. Lots of great information. You can read John Morgan's series, The Drive, every Saturday on Field Goals. And again, this podcast, Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur, the Instant Reaction Show, as well as any other podcast here, Seaside Chats, available at patreon.com for just $2 a month. This episode brought to you by sponsored by the Injury Legal Center, a personal injury law firm who has been specializing in auto accidents in California, Nevada, and Washington for over 20 years. If you like the show, you know, being sponsored and available, then you need a lawyer, then you might want to check out the Injury Legal Center. If you have an auto accident or slip and fall, you can call them at 855-631-3830. I'll put that in the body of the article for this podcast. They'll set you up with a doctor, handle all contact with the insurance companies for you. The Injury Legal Center works on a contingency basis, so you pay nothing out of pocket for legal fees or doctor visits unless they win your case. With over 2,000 active accident cases, they have a 98% success rate on verdicts against insurance companies. Call the Injury Legal Center today, toll free, 855-631-3830. Injury Legal Center, 855-631-3830. Much thanks to them. Much thanks to John Morgan for joining us on the show today. John, anything else you'd like to add? You're not active on Twitter these days, right?
No, I don't have time for that. I would just like to add thank you for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to talk some Seahawks.
Oh, absolutely, John. It's definitely it's a dream come true for me, man. You know, I wouldn't be a fan of field goals and where I am as a position there without your work in the beginning, and and in those eras when I started to read field goals, it was my beginning for field goals, at least with your work there, and so happy to have you writing there on the site again. And joining us on the show because that was really good, excellent information. And I think everybody will enjoy it. I can't speak for them, but we'll see what happens in terms of, I'm pretty sure they're going to enjoy it. Thanks again, John, for joining the show. This has been Seaside Chats. Seahawks 6-5. They host the San Francisco 49ers next Sunday. We'll preview that game this week. So stick around on patreon.com/field goals, patreon.com/field goals. And then they got the Minnesota Vikings on Monday night. So some more big games ahead for the Seattle Seahawks. They are close to position for the wild card, currently in the 7th seed behind Washington. And we'll see what happens moving forward. This is Kenneth Arthur for Seaside Chats. Come back next time for a new one.